The Aeldari are one of the most ancient and enduring civilizations of the galaxy, a species whose history stretches back into epochs so distant that they precede almost all recorded human memory. Their origin is interwoven with the very fabric of the War in Heaven, the great galactic conflict that first brought order, devastation, and structure to a young universe. Understanding the beginnings of the Aeldari requires placing them in the context of a cosmos that was still forming its first civilizations. Long before the rise of humanity, before the modern galactic order existed, the Aeldari were already being shaped into the people who would dominate entire star systems. Their presence and development were not accidental, but deeply tied to forces far greater than themselves, both natural and supernatural. The earliest origins of the Aeldari remain partly obscured by myth and partly reinforced by the few surviving records. According to the oldest fragments, they were shaped in the wake of the Old One's influence. The Old Ones, a master species of unimaginable power, were said to have designed many of the sentient beings of the galaxy as part of their struggle against the Necrontyr and the Catan. Among the most successful of their creations were the Aeldari, a species imbued with a connection to the immaterium that was far greater than any other mortal race had possessed up to that point. While the Necrontyr pursued mastery over material and physical sciences, the Aeldari were given the means to excel in psychic potential. This affinity would become both their greatest strength and, in later ages, the foundation of their greatest downfall. The design of the Aeldari was purposeful. They were not left to evolve by chance, but were cultivated to fill a role in the Old One's grand designs. As a species with immense psychic gifts, they became natural masters of the warp and of the material sciences that intertwined with psychic manipulation. Their minds were capable of shaping energy in ways that seemed like sorcery to less advanced species. They were envisioned as a countermeasure against the rise of the Necrontyr and their new gods, the Catan, who fed upon the energies of stars and turned entire civilizations into little more than livestock for their endless hunger. The Aeldari, unlike the cold and lifeless Necrons, represented vitality, adaptability, and a direct bond with the warp. They were meant to be a force that could resist and eventually outlast their enemies in a war that engulfed the galaxy itself. Physiologically, the Aeldari were created to be superior to most other mortal species. In height, they typically stood taller than a human, with average male heights around 6.5 feet and females around 6 feet, though there is some variation in this, with some ranges suggesting they can reach 7 feet or more with long, lithe forms. Their skeletal structure was lighter and more flexible than that of humans, but their musculature was far denser, allowing them to achieve feats of agility and strength that appeared superhuman by comparison. Their lifespan was measured not in decades but in millennia, and in those early times, before the psychic storms that came later, it is believed that many Aeldari could live for tens of thousands of years without the physical decline that afflicts mortal species. Their skin tone varied in shades of pale alabaster to deeper hues of bronze, their hair taking on a wide range of colours from dark black to silver and gold, with even exotic shades like blue or green recorded in rare cases. Their eyes, often described as larger and more reflective than those of humans, were windows into their extraordinary perception of both the material and the psychic planes. This physical excellence was not their most defining trait, however. It was their psychic strength. Every Aeldari was born with a natural sensitivity to the warp, a connection that allowed them to perceive and manipulate energies that humans would not discover for many millennia. This connection gave them unparalleled intuition, creativity, and emotional depth. Where other races struggled to imagine technologies or works of art, the Aeldari could draw directly from the currents of the warp to manifest ideas into reality. Their civilizations were marked by effortless technological integration, where thought and matter seemed to blend. The same sensitivity made them deeply vulnerable to the predations of the warp, but in the early ages before the birth of the Chaos powers in their terrible modern form, this vulnerability was not yet a curse. From their earliest days, the Aeldari showed a natural inclination for order, hierarchy, and discipline, particularly in matters of war. The War in Heaven demanded that every species aligned with the Old Ones serve as part of the greater struggle against the Necrons and their star gods. The Aeldari were no exception. Their military doctrine was defined by precision and overwhelming psychic support. Rather than rely on crude numbers or brute force, their armies emphasized agility, speed, and the exact application of force. Entire formations could move as one, guided not by shouted commands but by the shared intuition of their psychic bonds. Soldiers on the battlefield seemed to anticipate each other's actions, their coordination beyond anything achievable by unaugmented species. Recruitment into military service was less a matter of necessity and more of cultural expectation. Every Aeldari was trained from an early age in both the arts of war and the arts of creation. Unlike humanity, where soldiers were often drawn from specific classes or castes, the Aeldari saw martial ability as part of the whole being. To live as an Aeldari was to be capable of defending one's people and one's realm. Yet there were divisions among them, even in these early times. Some specialized as warriors, dedicating themselves entirely to martial perfection, while others balanced their warcraft with artistic or scientific pursuits. This duality between the sword and the brush, the warrior and the artisan, was already present and would remain an enduring feature of their culture. During the earliest conflicts of the War in Heaven, the Aeldari were deployed as both shock troops and strategic forces. Their mastery of psychic weaponry allowed them to unleash storms of destructive energy capable of cutting through Necron legions with devastating effect. At the same time, their ships and fleets were designed with elegance and efficiency, relying on speed and maneuverability rather than raw firepower. They struck quickly, disengaged when the battle turned against them, and preserved their forces for decisive moments. This style of war, relying on precision strikes and rapid redeployment, became their hallmark. It was not only their armies that gave them strength, but also their ability to terraform and shape worlds. The Aeldari could bend entire ecosystems to their will, creating paradises that reflected their aesthetic and spiritual ideals. This was more than comfort. It was a form of strategic depth. Worlds designed and maintained by the Aeldari became strongholds where their populations could thrive for millennia, free from disease, scarcity, or environmental collapse. These worlds became staging grounds for war as well, their natural abundance supporting massive military campaigns without the strain that crippled less advanced species. The early purpose of the Aeldari then was clear. They were meant to be a bulwark against the Necrons and the C'tan, a psychic counterweight to the material tyranny of the star gods. They embodied the Old One's philosophy that the warp could serve as a weapon just as potent as any physical construct. In these days, they were at the height of their design, not yet burdened by the excesses and corruption that would later define their fall. Their role in the War in Heaven was central, though not solitary, for they fought alongside other creations of the Old Ones, including the Krork and other species whose names are now mostly lost to history. Yet even in this golden beginning, there were signs of the traits that would eventually undo them. Their reliance on psychic power fostered a sense of superiority, an unshakable belief that they were above other species. Their longevity and intellect made them aloof, and their sensitivity to emotion made their societies prone to extremes of passion. While these characteristics fueled their brilliance in war and culture, they also planted the seeds of hubris. For the time being, however, the galaxy had need of their gifts, and the Old Ones had unleashed them as one of their greatest weapons in a war that spanned millennia. The technological style of the Aeldari during the War in Heaven was unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the galaxy. Their civilization was not bound by the slow, mechanical progressions of invention and discovery that characterized species like humanity in its primitive ages. Instead, their technology was an expression of psychic will shaped through material refinement. It was said that the Aeldari never truly invented in the way other species did. They remembered, drawing from the warp and their innate abilities to manifest designs that seemed as if they had always existed. In practice, this meant that their tools, their architecture, and their vehicles embodied an elegance and efficiency far beyond the crude constructions of their enemies. Where the Necrons relied on rigid geometry and oppressive structures of necrodermis and living metal, the Aeldari wove flowing organic forms into their ships and weapons, blending beauty with lethal effectiveness. Their weapons were perhaps the clearest expression of their philosophy. Instead of relying upon conventional projectiles or the raw harnessing of stellar energies as the Necrons did, the Aeldari developed tools that functioned by manipulating matter and psychic energy at its most fundamental levels. Their blades could resonate with psychic charge, slicing through matter with a precision beyond molecular sharpness. Their ranged weapons projected streams of energy that destabilized molecular cohesion, reducing their targets to dust or molten slag. These were not weapons of brute destruction, but of surgical annihilation. The Aeldari approached war as artists approached canvas, each strike an act of deliberate perfection. Vehicles extended this philosophy into mobility and dominance of space. Their grav tanks, which even in later ages would remain the standard of their ground forces, functioned not by crushing down upon terrain but by gliding effortlessly above it. These machines were living extensions of Aeldari craft, sleek and curved, often appearing as though they were grown rather than built. The same principle carried into their spacecraft. While the Necrons fielded heavy angular vessels designed for intimidation and raw destructive yield, the Aeldari fleets relied upon speed, precision, and the ability to be anywhere they wished in the theatre of war. Their ships were powered through means incomprehensible to most, drawing upon both advanced physical engineering and psychic resonance. They did not move through space in the same way as others, but slipped along paths and currents that others could not perceive, granting them a mobility advantage that was decisive in countless engagements. Maintenance of such technology was not a matter of mechanical repair alone. Each Aeldari machine carried within it a trace of psychic resonance, and to operate or sustain one required not only knowledge of engineering, but also sensitivity to the warp. This meant that their military was not divided between engineers and soldiers, as it might be in less advanced species. Every warrior had at least some understanding of the living aspect of their gear. Craft worlds and fleets sustained entire populations of individuals whose role was to harmonize with their tools, keeping them not just intact but in alignment with the collective psychic resonance of their civilization. This integration between warrior, artisan, and engineer defined the way the Aeldari functioned as a society. The social structure of the Aeldari in these early ages was hierarchical but not rigid. Unlike the Necron, who operated under oppressive dynastic rule, the Aeldari followed leaders whose authority was drawn from psychic potency, wisdom, and proven mastery of both war and art. Their society valued balance between martial and cultural excellence, and those who rose to prominence were often those who demonstrated perfection in multiple domains. Leadership councils guided their great fleets and colonies, but within these councils, individuals known for their psychic mastery often held the final authority. Theirs was not a rule of tyranny, but of guidance, and obedience stemmed from respect and recognition of superior ability rather than fear. At the same time, the Aeldari were not free of stratification. Within their society, divisions existed between those who dedicated themselves wholly to war and those who focused on the cultivation of art, science, or creation. The warrior elite formed a distinct caste, one that enjoyed both reverence and responsibility. To serve as a warrior was not to abandon the rest of life, but to embody the defense of the species. These individuals underwent rigorous training not just in physical combat, but in psychic discipline, learning to control the immense power that resided within them so that it did not consume them or spill uncontrollably into the battlefield. Training often began in early childhood, with young Aeldari taught to balance their natural sensitivity to emotion with the need for discipline. Left unchecked, an Aeldari's emotions could flare into destructive psychic outbursts. Disciplined, those same energies could become weapons sharper than any blade. Fleet organization reflected this same philosophy of unity between psychic and physical. Aeldari ships did not function merely as machines crewed by individuals, but as collective organisms guided by the synchronized will of their crews. Each ship could operate with uncanny precision, as if every member aboard were part of a single mind. In battle, entire flotillas moved as though choreographed, their maneuvers preempting the enemy with impossible foresight. This was not illusion. Their psychic connection allowed captains to anticipate enemy actions moments before they occurred, and the instinctive coordination of their crews transformed that knowledge into decisive advantage. When compared to the Necron fleets, which moved with relentless but predictable efficiency, the Aeldari formations seemed fluid, evasive, and impossible to pin down. The Necron brought inevitability, but the Aeldari brought unpredictability, and in those days, unpredictability often carried the victory. Civilian life was no less intertwined with this balance of war and artistry. To be an Aeldari civilian during the War in Heaven was to live in a society that left no one idle. Every member of their population was expected to contribute in some form, whether through creation, psychic labour, or defence. Civilian artisans produced not only works of beauty, but also the arms and tools of their warriors, and in Aeldari culture, there was little distinction between a weapon and a piece of art. Both were crafted with equal care, both meant to embody perfection. Likewise, those who tended to the living ships and cities of the Aeldari were engaged in work that was as much spiritual as it was technical, ensuring that the harmony of their society extended to every level of existence. The values that guided the Aeldari were rooted in this pursuit of harmony. Balance between war and peace, between individual expression and collective duty, between the psychic and the material, defined their civilization. They believed themselves to be the pinnacle of creation, and their culture reflected that self-assurance. Every act, from the forging of a blade to the composition of a poem, was treated as part of the greater perfection of their race. Yet within this belief lay the first stirrings of arrogance. The Aeldari viewed other species with condescension, regarding them as lesser beings either to be guided or ignored. This was not yet the unchecked hubris of their later empire, but even during the War in Heaven, seeds of superiority had already taken root. In war, the differences between the Aeldari and their enemies became starkly apparent. The Necron fought with relentless efficiency, their undying bodies marching in lockstep under the cold command of their masters. They relied upon overwhelming numbers and the impervious strength of necrodermis to grind their foes into submission. The Aeldari, by contrast, embraced speed, agility, and the creative application of power. Where Necron assaults resembled a storm front that advanced without deviation, Aeldari counterattacks were like lightning, striking swiftly at vulnerable points before vanishing into the void. The contrast in doctrine reflected the contrast in philosophy. The Necron believed in inevitability, the Aeldari believed in mastery. Each saw the other as anathema, and in their clashes the galaxy was torn apart. Hierarchy within the military reflected their broader societal values. Commanders were not chosen simply for birthright or longevity, but for the demonstration of skill and psychic clarity. Great captains and generals rose from the ranks through acts of brilliance and through the ability to lead their kin in perfect harmony. Orders were seldom shouted. Instead, guidance was transmitted through psychic resonance, with entire units responding as if with one will. This cohesion allowed for battlefield tactics that would have been impossible for species dependent on vocal command or technological relays. When an Aeldari force struck, it did so with absolute coordination, and when it withdrew, it seemed to vanish as though it had never been there at all. The cultural expectation of martial ability meant that there was no clear divide between civilian and soldier. At any given time, the majority of the population was capable of taking up arms if needed, though the warrior caste remained specialized for prolonged campaigns. This readiness gave the Aeldari enormous resilience. Entire populations could be mobilized in times of existential threat, and because every citizen had at least some training, the level of competency across even auxiliary forces was higher than the elites of many lesser species. The Old Ones had designed them to be versatile, and versatility became their greatest asset. It is important to note that this integration of society and military was not oppressive but natural. The Aeldari did not live under the constant burden of war as some might imagine. Rather, their existence was suffused with purpose. War and art were not opposites, but complementary pursuits. To create beauty was to affirm their superiority, and to wage war was to defend the space in which that beauty could exist. This outlook ensured that their society remained cohesive, with little internal strife during the War in Heaven. They were united by the clarity of their role in the conflict, and by the conviction that they embodied the greatest hopes of the Old Ones. Comparisons with the Necron highlight further distinctions. Where the Necrontyr society had collapsed into bitter tyranny and despair, leading them to barter their souls to the Catan, the Aeldari retained vitality and purpose. Their longevity shielded them from the desperation that had consumed the Necrontyr, and their psychic gifts gave them a sense of transcendence. The Necrontyr saw existence as suffering, the Aeldari saw it as a canvas to be perfected. This divergence of outlook shaped not only their strategies, but also the very way they perceived the war. For the Necrontyr, it was survival through domination. For the Aeldari, it was an expression of destiny. The role of leadership councils in their fleets and cities reflected this same theme. Authority was balanced, with no single ruler dominating every aspect of society. Instead, councils of seers, warriors, and artisans guided their people, each contributing perspective from their domain. In the greater scheme of the War in Heaven, this cohesion made the Aeldari one of the most effective tools of the Old Ones. Their technology, their social unity, and their military doctrines allowed them to strike devastating blows against the Necron and their star gods. Yet even in these victories, the traits that would later undo them lingered beneath the surface. Their sense of superiority hardened, their confidence in their own perfection deepened, and the same psychic gifts that gave them strength also made them vulnerable to the currents of emotion that swirled through their people. For now, however, those weaknesses remained hidden, overshadowed by the brilliance of their achievements in both war and civilization. The War in Heaven produced some of the most significant figures in Aeldari history, individuals whose names persisted for millennia even after much of their civilization was lost. These leaders embodied the qualities most revered by their people: mastery of the psychic arts, brilliance in war, and harmony of cultural and martial achievement. Among them, none were more influential than the seers who guided their kind through the turbulent tides of the conflict. While many Aeldari commanders rose and fell during these long wars, the most renowned were those who not only commanded fleets and armies, but also foresaw the greater strategies of the enemy and bent the warp itself to their designs. Their influence was such that battles often turned upon a single vision or act of insight, and victories were remembered as the achievements of both individuals and the collective will they represented. Though much of the precise record of these leaders has been lost in the passing of ages, the archetype of the Aeldari warlord was consistent. Physically, they exemplified the peak of their species, tall, lithe, and exuding both grace and lethality. They bore weapons and armor that seemed to flow as extensions of their very being, each piece designed specifically for them and resonant with their psychic signature. Many adorned themselves with symbols representing their lineage, achievements, and affinity for the warp, their armor often glowing faintly with energies imperceptible to other races. They were beings whose presence could inspire awe and fear in equal measure, their voices carrying not only authority but also the subtle undertone of psychic resonance that compelled obedience. The most famous leaders of the Aeldari in this era were seer commanders, individuals who combined the roles of strategist, prophet, and general. They were capable of directing entire campaigns with a clarity that transcended the ordinary. Where lesser generals relied on scouts or chance, Aeldari seers could perceive future possibilities, aligning their fleets and armies with uncanny precision. This did not mean that they were infallible. The warp is a shifting and deceptive realm, and even the greatest visions were prone to distortion. Yet their capacity to perceive multiple outcomes and choose among them gave the Aeldari a decisive advantage. Their enemies often accused them of cheating fate itself, striking at moments of weakness that could not have been predicted by reason alone. Supporting these commanders were warrior elites who represented the pinnacle of Aeldari martial discipline. These units formed the backbone of their war effort. Each group specialized in a distinct form of combat. Some excelled in close-quarter fighting, their blades moving with such speed that even Necron warriors encased in living metal could not withstand them. Others focused on ranged destruction, unleashing streams of energy that dissolved entire formations. Their war machines extended this specialization into the mechanized domain. Grav tanks armed with destabilizing weapons struck with surgical precision. Aircraft streaked across battlefields with unmatched agility and titanic constructs. Precursors to the Wraith constructs of later ages marched with devastating strength. Among the most notable of these war machines were constructs imbued with psychic resonance. It is believed that some of the earliest Wraith-like engines were created during this time, animated not by the souls of the dead, as in later eras, but by the psychic energies of the living. These war machines acted almost as independent beings, directed by the will of their operators, but capable of adapting with uncanny intelligence. They were monuments to the Aeldari's fusion of technology and psychic power, and they embodied the principle that every tool must be both beautiful and efficient. Against the legions of the Necron, these machines offered the Aeldari both strength and psychological advantage. The sight of an elegant, radiant construct striding into battle while emanating psychic force was enough to unsettle even the most relentless of enemies. Behaviorally, the Aeldari were a species shaped by instinct as much as by culture. Their psychic sensitivity meant that their emotions were more intense than those of most other beings. Joy, sorrow, pride, and rage all manifested with greater potency, often spilling into the psychic realm around them. This made them both exceptionally creative and dangerously volatile. In times of discipline, their instincts for harmony and unity made them capable of coordination unmatched by any rival. In times of passion or despair, however, their emotions could become uncontrollable, leading to destructive outbursts that threatened not only themselves but also their allies. The rigorous training of their society was designed to temper these instincts, channeling passion into art and war rather than letting it consume them. Their tendency toward extremes influenced their strategic choices as well. In war, they alternated between breathtaking patience and sudden bursts of overwhelming aggression. An Aeldari commander might wait centuries for the perfect opportunity, only to unleash devastation in a single decisive strike. This approach often confounded their enemies, who struggled to predict when the Aeldari would act. Their instincts were not random but refined by their psychic perceptions, and they often struck at the moment when their enemies were most unprepared. This behavior became one of their defining characteristics, unpredictability born from emotional intensity and psychic foresight. Rituals played an essential role in their society, both in civilian life and in war. Before battle, it was common for warriors to undergo ceremonies designed to align their psychic resonance with their weapons and armor. These rituals were not simply symbolic but functional, ensuring that their tools responded as extensions of their bodies. In their broader culture, rituals were woven into the rhythms of life. Seasonal ceremonies marked the alignment of stars and the ebb and flow of the warp. Artistic expression itself was ritualized, with music, sculpture, and architecture treated as sacred acts of creation. Each ritual reinforced their belief in balance and harmony, reminding them that every act, whether of war or peace, was part of a greater cosmic pattern. Their ethics reflected this same devotion to balance. The Aeldari viewed themselves as custodians of perfection, obligated to maintain harmony within their civilization. They valued loyalty to their kin, devotion to the collective good, and the pursuit of excellence in all things. Cowardice and mediocrity were among the gravest of faults, as they represented a betrayal of their species' potential. At the same time, their ethics allowed for ruthless action against outsiders. They felt little obligation to extend mercy to other species, whom they considered lesser. This duality, compassion within, indifference without, defined much of their moral structure. In war, it meant that they could be merciless in their dealings with enemies, yet among themselves they strove for unity and mutual perfection. Internal divisions within their society took the form of castes or specialized roles. While every Aeldari was trained in both art and war, individuals often gravitated toward one path more than the other. The warrior caste, as mentioned, embodied martial dedication. The artisan caste cultivated beauty and technology. The seer caste guided the species with psychic foresight. Each was interdependent, and though tensions sometimes arose between them, their society thrived on the interplay of these roles. Warriors relied upon artisans for their weapons, artisans depended upon warriors for protection, and all were guided by the visions of the seers. This triadic balance ensured that no single group dominated completely, though the seers often held the most influence due to their ability to perceive the warp's guidance. These castes were not rigid, however. An Aeldari might shift between roles over the course of a long life, exploring multiple paths before settling into one permanently. This flexibility allowed their society to remain dynamic, with individuals contributing in diverse ways. It also reinforced the belief that perfection required balance, for no one could embody the full spectrum of Aeldari potential without at least touching upon each role. The integration of these castes, the rituals that bound them, and the ethics that guided them formed the foundation of a civilization capable of both incredible brilliance and devastating destruction. In summary, the Aeldari during the War in Heaven were a people defined by their leaders of immense psychic power, their war machines that embodied elegance and lethality, their instincts that balanced harmony with volatility, their rituals that sanctified both art and battle, their ethics that upheld unity while dismissing outsiders, and their castes that maintained societal balance. These elements made them one of the most formidable forces in the galaxy, a civilization designed for perfection by the Old Ones, and forged in the crucible of the First Great Galactic War. Though the seeds of their later downfall were already present, during this epoch they stood as one of the Old Ones' greatest triumphs, unmatched in their ability to blend beauty, war, and psychic mastery into a single cohesive whole. When the vast bureaucracies of the Imperium turn their gaze upon the War in Heaven, the language they employ reflects the distance between millennia of myth and the clerical need for categorization. The Adeptus Administratum, guardians of written records and keepers of strategic analysis, describe the Aeldari as both a civilization of extraordinary refinement and a cautionary example of what unchecked advancement can yield. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in contrast, approach the Aeldari through the filter of machine theology. For the tech priests of Mars, the ancient empire of the Aeldari is less a people than an assemblage of technologies and knowledge systems, some revered, others despised, and all scrutinized for their potential alignment or opposition to the Omnissiah. The administratum impressions of the Aeldari during the War in Heaven often stress scale and continuity. Imperial scribes, constrained by their reliance on fragmented data and preserved myth, describe the Aeldari as inheritors of Necrontyr conflict and as an empire positioned between survival and dominance. The War in Heaven is recorded as the formative crucible that defined them, a war that transformed a species of biologically gifted artisans and warriors into the psychic fulcrum of the galaxy. Administratum historians categorize the Aeldari not simply as a race, but as one of the key civilizational nodes that determined the trajectory of the Milky Way. In their records, every later triumph and every later disaster, their galactic dominion, their collapse in the fall, their scattered survival in craft worlds, is traced back to the formative strategies employed during this first war. The Mechanicus impressions diverge sharply. Where the administratum constructs political narratives, the tech priests seek technological context. To them, the War in Heaven is remembered less as a contest of armies than as an exhibition of science at its highest and most forbidden application. The Aeldari mastery of psychic energy, the construction of war engines that could match or exceed the biotransference-enhanced Necron, and the harnessing of webway technology are all preserved in redacted Mechanicus archives as evidence of near-divine capability. Many such records are classified as blasphemous inspiration, material deemed too dangerous to allow into common study yet too valuable to erase. Mechanicus Magi speak of the Aeldari as artisans of the immaterium whose tools fused spiritual essence with mechanical form, a concept dangerously close to heresy by the standards of Mars but never fully denied. The relationship between these two imperial organs when describing the Aeldari is defined by their contrasting priorities. The Administratum emphasizes chronological placement, the roles of empires and wars, the shifts in political landscape. The Mechanicus emphasizes materials, function, weaponry, and metaphysics of design. Together they present the Aeldari as a people whose history resists complete capture by imperial models. Where one sees political precedent, the other sees technological heresy. Conflicts emerge even in how they interpret cooperation between ancient races. The Administratum depicts the Aeldari as having engaged in necessary alliances during the War in Heaven, their survival demanding coordination with other younger species, who were also threatened by the Necron. These records describe temporary military pacts, mutual defense agreements, and exchanges of information. The exact identities of these allied species are often left vague, preserved only as scattered names in fractured archives, but the impression is clear. The Aeldari were rarely alone in their struggle. The Adeptus Mechanicus, however, records cooperation through the lens of shared or stolen technology. To them, evidence of Aeldari engagement with other species is most compelling, where it involves exchange of tools. The Mechanicus archives suggest that the Aeldari may have absorbed, refined, or rejected technologies from allied civilizations during the War in Heaven. Some Mechanicus scribes speculate that this cross-pollination was not equal but exploitative, that the Aeldari used their superior psychic capacity to extract knowledge without reciprocation. Whether or not this is accurate, the perception reinforces the Mechanicus' suspicion of Aeldari craft, that every item, every weapon, every construct carries within it not only invention but appropriation. Politics becomes the final dimension through which these imperial institutions analyze the ancient Aeldari. For the Administratum, their politics are a mirror, evidence of how an advanced empire manages expansion, survival, and hierarchy when confronted with an existential threat. Administratum officials, especially those charged with managing imperial governance over countless worlds, note the striking parallel between Aeldari bureaucratic structures and the contemporary Imperium's own methods. Both are immense, both rely on stratified authority, and both attempt to impose order across stellar distances. Where the Imperium has Administratum clerks and planetary governors, the Aeldari of the War in Heaven era had councils of seers, noble houses, and martial castes, each designed to sustain coherence across their sprawling dominion. The Mechanicus approach Aeldari politics differently, framing it as an obstacle to technological purity. They argue that the psychic aristocracy of the Aeldari often subordinated technological application to cultural and spiritual imperatives. Where the Omnissiah demands absolute devotion to machine truth, the Aeldari saw technology as an extension of their identity, art, and metaphysical being. To the Mechanicus, this explains both their strength and their vulnerability. Their war engines were devastating, but their politics rendered them unable to maintain consistent doctrinal alignment, creating vulnerabilities exploited by the Necron and later echoed in the Fall. When Imperial records attempt to reconcile these impressions, a composite image emerges. The Aeldari during the War in Heaven are seen as a civilization of extraordinary coordination, capable of forging alliances, balancing complex political structures, and producing technologies that surpassed nearly all others of their age. Yet they are also remembered as dangerously arrogant, prone to relying on their innate psychic and cultural superiority. Administratum clerks preserved them as a warning to imperial governors, while Mechanicus Magi preserved them as a challenge, a reminder that there exists knowledge outside Mars' dominion. Thus, in the official archives of both institutions, the Aeldari are more than an ancient foe or vanished empire. They are simultaneously a mirror of what the Imperium has become and a spectre of what it fears. A people undone not by weakness, but by their own magnitude. In the preserved fragments of Administratum archives, The war in heaven is described as a conflict unlike any other, spanning entire galactic arms and consuming millennia in its unfolding. The Aeldari appear in these records as one of the foremost combatants alongside the Necrontyr and their newly forged Necron dynasties. For the bureaucrats of the Imperium, what survives of these wars is less a complete history and more a mosaic of encounters, pieced together from overlapping myths, translated Xenos inscriptions, and the suppressed notations of the Mechanicus. From these fragments emerges a portrait of the Aeldari as both conquerors and defenders, wielding methods of war that combined artistry, psychic mastery, and technological refinement. Administratum accounts often begin with the First Rising, the initial campaigns in which the Aeldari sought to shield their growing dominion from Necron aggression. In these wars, the Aeldari relied on speed and coordination, marshalling their forces across wide territories through the still expanding pathways of the Webway. Reports describe how Aeldari fleets appeared without warning at Necron-held systems, striking orbital platforms and colonies with precision before vanishing as quickly as they came. The fighting style recorded is less attritional and more surgical, designed to exploit weaknesses, overwhelm defences at select points, and retreat before counterattack could materialise. These early wars taught the Administratum clerks to classify the Aeldari as fluid aggressors, a term that remains in use to describe their later Craft World wars. The Mechanicus, when documenting these battles, focuses on the weaponry deployed. They describe fleets of elegant yet lethally efficient warships, armed not only with material munitions but with psychic conduits that amplified the destructive power of their seers. One record speaks of stellar lances, weapons that condensed energy into precision beams capable of shattering orbital fortresses in a single strike. Other documents preserve references to spirit-imbued constructs unleashed in planetary engagements. To the Magi of Mars, these were machines that blurred the distinction between living and artificial, each one a convergence of wraithbone, psychic resonance, and Aeldari craftsmanship. A notable engagement preserved in both Administratum and Mechanicus records is the Defense of the Crown Worlds, a collective term for the Aeldari counteroffensive when the Necron began their first large-scale incursion into Aeldari space. Administratum scribes describe it as a turning point, when the Aeldari proved capable of halting dynastic expansion through sheer force of arms. The Mechanicus describes it as the first widespread appearance of psycho-mechanical warforms, massive constructs piloted or guided by the souls of Aeldari dead, bound within wraithbone. These war engines are understood by tech priests as both military and spiritual technology, their very existence challenging the Mechanicus' separation of sacred machine from living essence. The battles for the Crown Worlds lasted centuries by imperial reckoning, with countless systems changing hands, but ultimately solidified the Aeldari's survival as a galactic power. The fighting style of the Aeldari during these wars reveals both discipline and adaptability. Administratum analysis classifies them as conscious of scale yet reluctant to engage in drawn attrition. Aeldari fleets avoided massive stand-up clashes unless the terrain favoured them, instead preferring ambushes, psychic subversion, and sudden assaults. Ground combat reflected similar preferences. Rather than legions of infantry locked in prolonged lines, Aeldari war hosts favoured mobility, striking units, and the calculated use of constructs. The Mechanicus observes this as evidence of a doctrine shaped by confidence in superior tools and psychic leverage. Battle details recorded in Mechanicus fragments often describe phenomena beyond the scope of conventional weaponry. In the Siege of the Void Spires, for example, it is said that entire Necron battalions were unmade not by physical destruction, but by psychic unravelling, their forms disassembled as the fabric of reality folded around them. In another campaign, later catalogued as the Harrowing of the Outer Reaches, Aeldari fleets harnessed gravitational manipulation to collapse Necron orbital fortresses into their parent planets, rendering entire systems uninhabitable. These accounts are partially dismissed by Administratum clerks as embellished metaphors, yet their repeated presence in Mechanicus data vaults suggests some basis in fact. Not every battle ended in Aeldari victory. Administratum records speak with somber neutrality of the cataclysm at the dying stars, where Aeldari fleets were trapped by dynastic forces and annihilated. Hundreds of craft were lost, and entire bloodlines of noble houses erased in a single campaign. The Mechanicus finds fascination in these defeats, interpreting them as moments when Aeldari over-reliance on psychic foresight was outmaneuvered by Necron technology, immune to such intrusion. To them, the cataclysm proves that even the most advanced psychic arsenal can fail when confronted with the silent nullfields of the Necron. What unifies all recorded impressions of these wars is the scale. Both Administratum and Mechanicus accounts agree that the War in Heaven was unlike any conflict since, spanning not only worlds but entire stellar networks. Aeldari war hosts deployed forces across such vast distances that even Administratum scribes, accustomed to imperial tithe logs and campaign charts, struggle to quantify them. Some records describe battles that lasted generations, others that ended within moments of psychic detonation. What emerges is a portrait of a species that fought with elegance and ferocity, confident in their superiority, yet always aware that the Necron posed a threat equal to their power. In the final analysis, the notable wars and battles of the War in Heaven show the Aeldari at their height. They are preserved as warriors of precision, commanders of fleets that could appear and vanish at will, artisans of war machines that fuse the psychic and the material, yet they are also remembered as vulnerable to arrogance, at times blinded by their reliance on foresight and underestimating the silent efficiency of their enemies. Administratum scribes mark these wars as formative. Mechanicus Magii mark them as lessons. Both recognize them as demonstrations of what the Aeldari were before their fall, a people whose wars define the galaxy itself. The surviving accounts of the War in Heaven are uneven, fragmented by time, distorted by translation, and shaped by the biases of imperial archivists. Yet both the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus preserve scattered records of additional battles beyond the major engagements already discussed. These secondary campaigns, though often less detailed, provide crucial insight into the ways the Aeldari fought and endured. The Mechanicus aftermath analysis is more ambivalent. To them, the War in Heaven is not defined solely by the Aeldari's triumph over the Necron, but by the technologies that emerged or were lost in its course. The tech priests catalogue the Aeldari's use of wraithbone constructs, psychic war engines, and webway expansion as achievements of such magnitude that even in decline, fragments of these systems remain far beyond imperial comprehension. In their final analyses, the Administratum and the Mechanicus converge on a singular point. The War in Heaven defined the Aeldari in ways that no later era could undo. The Administratum preserves them as a political entity, whose rise to supremacy reshaped the galaxy's history and whose mistakes would later echo through millennia. The Mechanicus preserves them as a civilization whose technologies defied categorization, challenging the very boundaries between machine and spirit. Where the Administratum cautions imperial governors against arrogance, the Mechanicus warns tech priests of the dangers of pursuing knowledge without constraint. Together, their impressions form a composite memory. The Aeldari of the War in Heaven are remembered not simply as warriors, but as architects of a galaxy-spanning legacy. Their victories are preserved as models of precision, their defeats as lessons in vulnerability, their aftermath as both triumph and tragedy. In the bureaucratic order of the Administratum and the techno-mystical registers of the Mechanicus, the War in Heaven remains not only a record of battles long past, but also a living caution, a mirror held up to the Imperium itself. When the Inquisition turns its attention to the War in Heaven, their records diverge sharply from those of the Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Where clerks and tech priests attempt to catalogue or interpret, inquisitors sift, redact, and suppress. For the Inquisition, the Aeldari during the War in Heaven are not merely an extinct empire of myth, but a subject of active concern. Their rise, their victories, and their methods of war all hold implications for the present, for the Aeldari who survive, and for the Imperium's precarious dominion over a hostile galaxy. The Inquisition's impressions are shaped by three persistent fears: that knowledge of the War in Heaven might destabilize imperial faith, that technologies from that era might resurface in the present, and that the Aeldari themselves might attempt to reclaim some fragment of their lost supremacy. Thus, what records the Inquisition has preserved are often contradictory, designed not to inform but to control the flow of knowledge. Inquisitorial archives describe the Aeldari as both the greatest victors of the War in Heaven and as its deepest victims, depending on which interpretation better serves the suppression of truth. The first impression repeated in multiple sealed reports is the sheer scale of Aeldari dominance. Inquisitors note with unease that the Aeldari did not simply survive the War in Heaven, but emerge from it as the preeminent galactic power. This fact is carefully downplayed in wider administratum teachings, where emphasis is placed instead on their eventual collapse during the fall. Inquisition records warn that acknowledging the Aeldari's supremacy risks undermining the doctrine of human destiny. To present them as once unrivaled rulers would invite comparisons the Imperium cannot allow, that humanity is not the galaxy's rightful inheritor, but merely a latecomer occupying the ruins of older empires. A second impression lies in their methods. Inquisitorial files repeatedly highlight the fusion of psychic force and material power. Unlike the Mechanicus, who record such systems as technological curiosities, the Inquisition frames them as existential threats. Aeldari constructs that bound souls into war engines are cited as examples of sorcerous abominations, whose re-emergence could destabilize the Immaterium itself. One sealed transcript speaks of machines that think with dead minds, an allusion to wraithbone constructs. For the Ordo Malleus, these represent dangerous precursors to demon-possessed warforms, a parallel that demands suppression. The Ordo Xenos, by contrast, regards them as weapons that could potentially be replicated or countered, and therefore must be studied in secrecy. The Inquisition also preserves impressions of Aeldari arrogance. Their records frame the Aeldari not only as enemies of the Necron, but as potential manipulators of lesser races during the War in Heaven. Some Ordo Xenos documents suggest that the Aeldari may have deliberately cultivated alliances with younger species, exploiting them as buffers against Necron expansion. Others speculate that entire species may have been guided, altered, or even extinguished at Aeldari discretion. The reliability of these accounts is uncertain, but their preservation reflects inquisitorial suspicion that the Aeldari have always treated other races as tools, pawns in their long survival. Politically, the Inquisition impressions diverge from administratum narratives. Whereas the administratum depicts the Aeldari as an advanced polity, struggling and triumphing against an equal foe, the Inquisition frames them as an enduring danger. Their survival through the War in Heaven is not presented as a historical inevitability, but as evidence of a continuing pattern. The Aeldari endure when others perish. From the perspective of the Ordo Hereticus, this resilience is a warning. If they survived the War in Heaven, they might endure the Imperium as well. Religious undertones run through some sealed reports, particularly those influenced by inquisitors aligned with the ecclesiarchy. In these accounts, the Aeldari are described as a species damned from their origin, their psychic sensitivity making them vulnerable to the warp's corruption even before the fall. The War in Heaven is reinterpreted as an early sign of their spiritual frailty, their triumph over the Necron dismissed as hollow in light of their eventual collapse. These impressions are not universally held but are preserved in inquisitorial archives as justification for continued vigilance and hostility. Finally, there is the matter of silence. Inquisition records often remark on what is missing from other accounts, battles erased from memory, technologies never fully described, and anomalies within the war that resist explanation. Some files suggest that the Aeldari themselves engaged in deliberate erasure, sealing parts of their own history to prevent misuse. Others hint that the Necron's stasis has obscured truths too dangerous to surface. For the Inquisition, these silences are themselves dangerous. What is hidden may someday be uncovered, and what is uncovered may destabilize the Imperium. Thus, the Inquisition's impression of the Aeldari during the War in Heaven is not that of a dead empire, but of a shadow still cast across the present. They are remembered as victors whose triumph destabilized the galaxy, as technologists whose weapons blur the line between soul and machine, as manipulators who use lesser races, and as a species whose silence conceals more than their words reveal. For the Inquisition, this impression demands only one response: vigilance without end. The Inquisition's archival records concerning the War in Heaven often highlight a recurring difficulty. The line between myth and history blurs so extensively that even the most disciplined attempts at categorization can lead to contradictions. Where the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus focused on timelines, campaigns, and technological analysis, the Inquisition tends to focus on anomalies. These are the inconsistencies, gaps, and phenomena within surviving accounts that suggest the Aeldari's role in the War in Heaven was even more complex than the already contradictory narrative indicates. Inquisition scribes frequently remark on the dissonance between Necron and Aeldari-centered retellings of the conflict. Some surviving Necron inscriptions emphasize that the Aeldari were a secondary nuisance, intervening primarily through psychic disruption rather than open war. Yet Aeldari myth and subsequent fragmented records place their ancestors at the forefront of resistance against the Necrontyr and later against the C'tan themselves. The truth, as the Inquisition often observes, may be concealed beneath deliberate obfuscation. Both races had reason to distort the record, the Necrons to downplay their defeats, the Aeldari to exaggerate their victories. One of the primary anomalies flagged in sealed Ordo Xenos archives concerns the scale of Aeldari mobilization. Certain Mechanicus calculations extrapolated from battlefield ruins of impossible age suggest that Aeldari fleets and armies numbered in the billions during the War in Heaven. Yet mythological accounts transmitted through the remnants of Aeldari culture imply a war effort that was more decentralized, relying on highly elite hosts rather than vast legions. Reconciling these accounts has proven impossible. Some inquisitors argue that the Aeldari may have shifted their approach depending on the phase of the war, deploying overwhelming numbers when threatened with extinction, but otherwise preferring precise and highly skilled interventions. Equally troubling are anomalies in recorded battlefields. For example, the dead worlds catalogued within Segmentum Obscurus show evidence of weapons fire patterns consistent with phase technology used by the Necrons, yet in some cases there are indications of complete molecular disruption that do not align with Necron weaponry alone. Several sealed Mechanicus reports, accessed by the Ordo Xenos, speculate that these might represent Aeldari protoforms of what would later evolve into the psychic weaponry seen in constructs such as the Wraithguard or D-cannons. If true, it would indicate that the Aeldari were conducting advanced psychic physical weapon research long before Imperial human history began, and that their grasp of reality warping technology was already mature during the War in Heaven. The Inquisition also records multiple anomalies surrounding the timeline of Aeldari resistance. Some reports indicate that Aeldari forces survived the apparent conclusion of the War in Heaven with greater numbers and stability than their surviving myths suggest. Yet other archives, notably those drawn from cross-referenced Necron tomb inscriptions, imply catastrophic losses so severe that the Aeldari were reduced to a shadow of their once mighty empire. To complicate matters further, Ordo Chronos operatives working in parallel have identified temporal inconsistencies on battlefields attributed to this conflict. Radiation decay rates, strata disruptions, and other chronometric evidence sometimes suggest that multiple conflicts took place across the same physical space, but at different points in a fragmented timeline. The Inquisition has flagged these anomalies as possible indicators of temporal interference, either by the C'tan, by Aeldari manipulation of the warp, or by mechanisms still entirely unknown. Among the most heavily redacted sealed reports are those concerning alleged Aeldari direct encounters with Old One technology. It is widely accepted that the Old Ones orchestrated much of the resistance to the Necron and C'tan, often using the Aeldari and other younger races as instruments of war. However, scattered evidence suggests that Aeldari forces may have uncovered, replicated, or even stolen Old One weapons. Some inquisitorial records, accessible only to the highest ranks of the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus, speculate that these artifacts might still exist, hidden within webway vaults, or in lost craft worlds that never emerged after the fall. If verified, this would mean that Aeldari survivors of the War in Heaven carried with them more than cultural memory. They may have borne forward weapons of almost godlike power. Another anomaly lies in Aeldari battlefield behaviour. Across multiple sealed testimonies from rogue traders and explorers who claim to have accessed ruins predating humanity, there are descriptions of battle scars that do not fit with conventional strategic reasoning. Entire regions appear to have been deliberately erased, not merely conquered. This form of total erasure goes beyond the Necron practice of extermination, which often left usable resources intact. The Inquisition interprets this as potential Aeldari scorched earth tactics, possibly driven by a desire to deny the Catan or Necron access to vital resources. Some speculate this tendency may reflect a deep cultural instinct among the Aeldari to control and curate their environment, even to the point of annihilation if control could not be maintained. Sealed reports also speak of psychological anomalies surrounding Aeldari survivors. Inquisitorial mind-scrying of certain captured Aeldari souls, performed through extreme measures that border on the forbidden, has revealed echoes of ancient memory far older than their biological lifespan should permit. While normally explained as cultural resonance passed through the infinity circuit and reincarnation myths, certain inquisitors suspect that Aeldari lifespans during the War in Heaven may have operated under rules unknown to the Imperium. Some theories propose that Aeldari warriors could extend their consciousness indefinitely through psychic transference, effectively surviving from one body to another across entire millennia of war. If true, then certain legendary figures may not represent symbolic archetypes, but literal individuals who fought across the entire span of the War in Heaven. Encounters documented by the Inquisition also extend into more esoteric domains. A handful of sealed Ordo Malleus reports suggest that Aeldari psychic warfare during the War in Heaven left permanent scars upon the warp. These are said to manifest in present times as unstable warp storms, haunted regions of space, or phenomena that resist both Imperial navigation and chaos incursion. Though impossible to verify, if true, it would mean the Aeldari once possessed the power to alter the fabric of reality in ways that continue to ripple across the galaxy 40 million years later. Another striking anomaly comes from the intersection of Aeldari myth and surviving Necron archives, the so-called Silent Wars. These are conflicts that do not appear in most mainstream histories, but are hinted at in both Aeldari epic poetry and in deeply encrypted Necron data scripts. They describe prolonged campaigns fought entirely within the webway, and similar sub-realities, in which neither side sought conquest of planets, but rather control over pathways of transit. If these records are accurate, it means that a vast shadow war was fought parallel to the main campaigns of the War in Heaven, a conflict invisible to most observers, but crucial in determining long-term strategic dominance. The Inquisition has classified much of this material as unverified, but maintains ongoing investigation, as it could explain the otherwise puzzling survival of Aeldari civilization despite apparent defeat at the Necrons' hands. The sealed reports also reveal that Aeldari psychic anomalies may have distorted Imperial records of chronology itself. Inquisitorial archivists working alongside the Ordo Chronos believe that the Aeldari's attempts to weaponize the warp may have created localized loops or distortions in time. Evidence includes overlapping strata, where battles seem to have been fought multiple times with slight variations in outcome, or ruins in which artifacts from different eras coexist without explanation. While the Mechanicus often interprets these anomalies as data corruption, or natural temporal degradation, the Inquisition treats them with suspicion. There remains the possibility that the War in Heaven was not fought along a single linear timeline, but rather across fractured or parallel sequences, with the Aeldari themselves either victims or participants in this phenomenon. Inquisition perspectives emphasize caution in drawing definitive conclusions. Sealed records consistently remind their readers that much of the War in Heaven is beyond full human comprehension. Yet the anomalies catalogued, whether unexplained battlefield evidence, contradictory accounts of scale, or strange temporal distortions, indicate that the Aeldari's role in the war was far from simple. To reduce it to a binary of victory or defeat would be misleading. Instead, the Inquisition views the Aeldari as both triumphant and broken, wielders of near-godlike technology yet destined for collapse. The anomalies are not dismissed as errors, but rather preserved as warnings. They represent the enduring truth that the Aeldari once touched forces capable of bending reality itself, and that fragments of that power may still remain hidden in the galaxy, awaiting discovery or misuse. The first category of classified material concerns the alleged preservation of Old One artifacts by the Aeldari. Several records suggest that during the later stages of the war, when the Old Ones themselves began to falter under the combined assault of the Necrons and the C'tan, Aeldari hosts were entrusted with or seized fragments of their technology. These weapons and devices were not merely advanced, but were capable of altering the structure of reality at fundamental levels. Reports describe stasis chambers that halted time, reality-weaving engines that folded space, and psychic amplifiers that could draw the essence of the warp into concentrated destructive force. The Inquisition has classified such claims as highly sensitive, for if they are true it would mean that the Aeldari still hold weapons older than chaos itself. Other classified records concern the nature of the Aeldari soul. During sanctioned dissections and psychic interrogations of Aeldari individuals in later millennia, faint echoes were detected that seemed to suggest survival of memory across incarnations. Some Ordo Malleus records even argue that the Aeldari's role in the war in heaven was shaped by their unique ability to bind their psychic essence to the warp in ways that circumvented normal mortality. If accurate, this would explain why certain Aeldari heroes or figures appear in accounts spanning tens of thousands of years, maintaining continuity of identity. It would also mean that fragments of consciousness from that ancient war may still inhabit present-day Aeldari, whether knowingly or unknowingly. A further category of sealed documents concerns anomalies in planetary records. The Inquisition has charted worlds where archaeotech ruins bear evidence of both Necron and Aeldari occupation, yet the timelines of habitation overlap in ways that defy linear history. On certain dead planets, Aeldari ruins are found beneath Necron structures that themselves predate the rise of Aeldari civilization. One classified hypothesis is that the Aeldari, by using warp manipulation, may have seeded their presence backward into time, creating paradoxes that defy standard chronology. The Ordo Chronos views such speculation with particular alarm, as it suggests that the war in heaven may have unfolded across not only space, but across divergent time paths, creating histories where outcomes were fought repeatedly until stabilized. Perhaps the most troubling classified material revolves around the sealed testimonies of Aeldari seers. Across millennia, fragments of prophecy collected by the Inquisition and stored within the archives indicate that some Aeldari maintain living memory of the war in heaven. Whether through psychic vision, reincarnation, or manipulation of time, these seers have occasionally provided testimony that describes the war not as a completed event, but as a continuing reality. According to these records, the echoes of the war in heaven are not confined to the distant past, but continue to unfold in hidden strata of reality. If true, this would render much of Imperial historical analysis incomplete, as the conflict may not yet have fully ended. The final tier of classified records, restricted even within the Ordo Xenos, are those labelled Ordo Ultima. These describe theories that the Aeldari were never mere pawns of the Old Ones, but co-architects of the war itself. In this interpretation, the Aeldari were elevated not simply as soldiers of the Old Ones, but as co-creators of strategies, builders of webway structures, and designers of weapons whose function even the Old Ones did not entirely master. Such claims are dangerous to the Imperial worldview because they elevate the Aeldari from the role of fallen Xenos to that of near equals to the gods of creation. If circulated, such knowledge could undermine the centrality of the Emperor's divine narrative, which depends on human destiny being unique. From the Inquisition's perspective, the war in heaven serves less as a closed chapter of Xenos prehistory than as a constant warning. Its lessons are preserved in classified files not for academic curiosity but for survival. The records show that civilizations of almost limitless power have risen fought, and fallen. The Aeldari were among the greatest of these, possessing technology, psychic mastery, and cultural unity that far exceeded anything humanity has achieved. Yet their fate was collapse. The Inquisition repeatedly stresses this point. If a race as advanced as the Aeldari could be broken, then humanity must never assume itself secure, no matter the Emperor's protection. The final thoughts of the Inquisition on this matter, preserved in closing statements across multiple dossiers, adopt a consistently cautious tone. The Aeldari are not dismissed as relics of a dead empire. They are seen as survivors of an ancient cataclysm, carrying with them memories and artifacts of a war that predates human civilization by millions of years. They remain unpredictable, not merely because of their arrogance or instability, but because they carry scars of a conflict that shaped reality itself. Their perspective is alien, drawn from a time when gods walked openly, when mortality and time were pliable, and when survival demanded compromises and powers that the Imperium can scarcely fathom. Thus, the Inquisition concludes that the war in heaven cannot be safely relegated to distant history. Its anomalies, its sealed reports, and its classified insights remind the Imperium that the galaxy remains haunted by conflicts far older than humanity. The Aeldari are the most enduring witnesses to that age, and through them, the war in heaven continues to cast its shadow across the present. Inquisitorial policy dictates vigilance, suppression of destabilizing truths, and the careful preservation of classified files, not to preserve academic purity, but to guard against the resurgence of forces that once brought reality itself to the brink of collapse. The last note found in a sealed Ordo Xenos document sums up this perspective with restrained clarity. The Aeldari are not merely remnants of an ancient people, they are fragments of an ancient war. To underestimate them is to underestimate the weight of history itself,